John Armstrong, a millionaire whose reputation is as strong as his fortune, has always been a mystery to those around him. His mansion in New York, a majestic neo-Gothic structure, reflects both his success and his solitude. Situated in an exclusive neighborhood, the mansion is surrounded by high stone walls and iron gates, as if trying to protect John not only from intruders but also from his own memories and regrets. The interior of the house is a direct reflection of his life. Luxurious yet cold, with long silent corridors echoing with the sound of lonely footsteps. Ancient paintings adorn the walls, but none of them are family photos, only expensive artworks that seem to represent loneliness in its essence. At 70 years old, John had built a financial empire through years of hard work and calculated decision. Every move in the market, every investment was meticulously planned, and this attention to detail earned him an enviable fortune. However, what the numbers in his bank accounts didn't reveal was the emptiness that had spread through his heart. The wealth he had accumulated over the years, instead of bringing him the happiness he so desired, only served to build more barriers between him and the rest of the world. Friends who once stood by him drifted away, some out of envy, others because they felt John had become inaccessible, more machine than man. And now, with a terminal illness consuming his body, John is confronted with the harsh reality that, despite all his wealth, he is poorer than ever in terms of human connections. The complexities of his personal life always haunted him. Emily, his only daughter, was always the opposite of John. While he was cold, calculating, and reserved, Emily was emotional, impulsive, and passionate. The relationship between the two had been tense since she was a child. John, unable to express his love openly, focused on providing materially, believing this was the most sincere form of care. Emily, on the other hand, longed for affection and understanding, something she never received from her father. The gap between them grew over the years, eventually becoming irreparable. Emily distanced herself, cutting ties completely, and John, though deeply hurt by this, never saw her out. Too proud to admit his mistakes, he simply let her go, another loss in a life full of sacrifices and personal renunciations. Laura, John's wife, is a figure that causes discomfort to those who know her. Ambitious and shrewd, Laura was always attracted to the power and prestige that marriage to John afforded her. But over time, what began as admiration for John's intelligence and strength turned into impatience and resentment. Laura is a woman who values status above all else and sees John's illness as an opportunity, not a tragedy. She and their son James, a man in his 40s with the same hunger for power as his mother, impatiently await the moment when John is no longer around. Their plan is clear: take control of the entire fortune and ensure that nothing is left for Emily, whom Laura has always seen as a threat to what she believes is rightfully hers. Margaret, the nurse hired to care for John, is a woman who, despite her professional demeanor, has deep empathy for those under her care. Middle age has brought her a quiet wisdom and infinite patience. Unlike Laura and James, Margaret sees John's suffering and gradually begins to notice that behind the impenetrable facade is a man deeply regretful and desperate for some form of redemption. She notices how he avoids looking directly at the portrait of Emily he keeps in his bedside drawer, and how his eyes fill with silent sadness every time his daughter's name is mentioned. As the days pass, Margaret becomes more than just a caregiver to John. She becomes the only person with whom he can open up, even if only subtly and indirectly. Her presence in the mansion, though professional, begins to bring a warmth that has long been absent from the place. She realizes that in his moments of greatest weakness, John longs for something that cannot be bought: forgiveness, reconciliation, and perhaps one last chance to connect with those he has pushed away. As John's health continues to decline, the tension within the house grows. Laura and James, always lurking, begin to notice the bond Margaret is developing with John and become increasingly suspicious of her intentions. To them, Margaret is just another piece on the board they need to control or eliminate. But to John, she represents the last hope for redemption in a life full of regrets and irreparable mistakes. Margaret dedicated herself with quiet determination to making John Armstrong's final days more bearable. The environment around them was a mixture of opulence and loneliness. where the heavy curtains on the mansion's windows blocked out natural light, creating a space where time seemed to stand still. Material wealth was evident in every corner, from the crystal chandeliers to the Persian rugs that muffled footsteps. There was a glaring absence of human warmth. And it was in this emotional void that Margaret became an essential presence, offering John not only relief from his physical pain, but also the rare company of someone who had no hidden interest in his fortune. Margaret quickly realized that medical care was only a part of her role there. John, in his old age and frailty, didn't just need medicine. He needed someone who could listen to the confessions of a life marked by tough decisions and deep regrets. Gradually, she became John's confidant, a role he never expected to find in a nurse, which, somehow, was more comforting than any medical treatment. Sitting by his bedside while the world outside continued without them, Margaret listened intently to John's accounts of his life, of the businesses that built his empire, but also isolated him from everything that truly mattered. Let's play a little game with those who only read the comment. They won't understand. Comment French fries below. Only those who read this far will get it. And now, let's continue with the story. Conversations grew more intimate, revealing the man behind the imposing facade. John spoke of Emily, his daughter, with a heart-wrenching pain. He recalled how she was as a child, with her radiant smile and endless questions about the world. He remembered how she eagerly waited for him to play in the garden, but how he, always busy, just waved and went straight to his office. Margaret could see that, for John, these memories were both a comfort and a torment. Constant reminder that the time he wasted could never be reclaimed. One day, during one of these confessions, John revealed what Margaret was already beginning to realize. His greatest regret wasn't a business failure, but the fact that he never reconciled with Emily. He knew his time was running out, and with that came a desperate urgency. In a moment of vulnerability, something rare in a man who always kept control of his emotions, John made an unusual request to Margaret. He looked her in the eyes, with an expression of pain and hope intertwined, and asked her to pretend to be Emily for a day. Margaret, caught off guard, felt the weight of the responsibility in that request. She knew that by accepting, she would not only be playing a role, but also carrying the emotional burden of an unresolved relationship. For a moment, she hesitated, considering the ethical and emotional implications of such an act. But when she saw the anguished expression on John's face, who for the first time seemed truly broken, she couldn't refuse. Margaret understood the depth of his pain and, with a heavy yet determined heart, accepted his request. The next day, Margaret entered John's room with a simplicity that contrasted with the luxury around her. She wore a modest, unadorned dress, something she imagined Emily might have worn. She approached John, who was lying in bed, increasingly frail and consumed by illness. When he saw her, John's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't just the sight of Margaret that moved him, but the idea that, for a brief moment, he might feel the love he so deeply longed for from his daughter. Margaret, with a gentleness that reflected all the compassion she felt for the man at death's door, began to speak as if she were Emily. She adopted a loving tone, recalling moments from Emily's childhood that John had shared with her. As she spoke, Margaret watched John's reactions, how he closed his eyes, perhaps to avoid breaking the illusion, allowing himself to dive into the memories they were creating together. She mentioned the dreams Emily had, the same ones John never had time to hear, and spoke of a future that, tragically, never be. For John, those words were like a balm, easing, even if just for a moment, the pain of a life filled with regrets. He knew, somewhere inside, that this wasn't really his daughter, but at that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he felt, even for a brief moment, the affection and connection he had lost over the years. For Margaret, pretending to be Emily was both a sacrifice and an act of deep compassion, offering John one last chance at peace before the inevitable end. John, with a heavy heart and eyes still wet with emotion, experiences a whirlwind of feelings after his encounter with Margaret, who for a few moments gave him the illusion of a reconciliation with his lost daughter. The mix of joy and sadness consuming him, almost unbearable, as he feels the closeness of a love that, in reality, is distant. For the first time in many years, he allows himself to openly express his pain, speaking in a trembling voice about how much he misses Emily and how he regrets the choices that drove them apart. His voice, broken by sobs, reveals a shattered man who, at the end of his life, realizes that all his power and wealth cannot erase the mistakes of the past. Margaret, sitting beside John, holds his hand firmly, providing comfort that goes beyond words. Although her presence there is the result of a compassionate ruse, forgiveness she offers in Emily's name is sincere, born of deep empathy. "I forgive you, Dad," he says, her soft voice carrying a sincerity that touches the depths of John's soul. "You did the best you could. Now, find peace in the time you have left." These words, though part of a merciful act, bring John unexpected relief, temporary serenity he hadn't felt in a long time. He closes his eyes and takes a deep breath, feeling as if a massive weight has been lifted from his shoulders. For a few moments, the atmosphere in the room is almost sacred, where time seems to have stopped, giving John a brief respite from his emotional agony. But this peace is cruelly interrupted when the door suddenly opens, letting in a cold draft that seems to announce the arrival of something dark. Laura enters first, with determined steps and a serious expression that leaves no doubt about her intentions. Behind her, James follows with the same cold determination, and shortly after, the lawyer enters, carrying a worn leather briefcase that likely holds the final fate of John's fortune. Their presence shatters the bubble of tranquility that had surrounded John, and he suddenly finds himself dragged back into harsh reality. He looks at Laura, and what he sees in her eyes is a mix of calculation and impatience, not the concern of a wife, but the greed of someone who has waited a long time to claim what she believes is rightfully hers. John realizes, with painful clarity, that while he was lost in his regrets, seeking redemption and peace, Laura and James were busy, waiting for this moment, not to offer comfort, but to secure their share of the inheritance. Change in atmosphere is palpable. The room, which moments earlier had been a refuge of deep feelings, now fills with an almost suffocating tension. The air feels heavier, and the glimmer of hope in John's eyes begins to fade, replaced by a shadow of distrust and sadness. He watches Laura's every move, every word she utters with that cold, calculating voice that tries to mask her true intention with a false concern. "John," she begins, maintaining a controlled tone, "it's time to discuss your final wishes. Need to make sure everything is in order so there are no complications later." She hands the envelope to the lawyer, quickly opens it, and begins to flip through the papers with the efficiency of someone used to dealing with the end of wealthy lives. He starts explaining the will's provisions, his professional tone contrasting with the grim content of his words. Here, it's established how your assets will be distributed. The lawyer's tone is neutral, but the furtive glance he casts at Laura and James does not go unnoticed by John, who now feels he's being treated more as a valuable object to be divided than as a human being. Still shaken by the emotional experience with Margaret, John feels his heart harden once again. He realizes that the peace he experienced was only a fleeting glimpse, and that the reality around him is dominated by petty interests and greed. But at the same time, something inside him refuses to completely surrender. He is no longer the same man who let coldness and distance dominate him. Something in the reconciliation experience with Margaret changed him, even if only slightly, and he knows he cannot let Laura and James win without at least one last fight. He presses his lips together, and with a look that mixes exhaustion and determination, prepares to face this final battle, knowing that his choices at that moment will define his final legacy. John watches in silence, every word that Laura and the lawyer speak piercing like knives into his already weakened heart. The feeling of betrayal envelops him like a cold, heavy fog, difficult to dissipate. He bitterly realizes that, to Laura and James, he was never more than a means to an end, a valuable object to be exploited until the last breath. The pretense of a family that he had maintained for so long now reveals itself in its rawest and most inhumane form, and this consumes him with a devastating mix of anger and sadness. It's as if his entire life, built on success and power, is crumbling before his eyes, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. The man who was once a figure of control, a business titan who shaped the world to his will, now finds himself reduced to a fragile and disposable piece in the game of interests of his own family. He wants to scream, to fight against the injustice he feels. His frail body does not obey. Every attempt to raise his voice is stifled by his weakened health. Every gesture of resistance becomes futile in the face of the weakness that now defines his existence. John tastes the bitter flavor of impotence, a taste he had never known before, but that now seems to be his only reality. That night, the mansion, which already seemed dark and empty, becomes an even more desolate place. John remains awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as his mind takes a painful journey through the memories of his life. The shadows dance on the walls of the room, and each one seems to bring with it a memory of past decisions, each one heavier than the last. He mentally revisits every choice that led him to this moment. Decisions that built his fortune, but at the same time, isolated him from everyone who could have offered him some kind of true love. Loneliness now presents itself to him in all its extent, a vast and endless desert where he is lost, without a compass and without hope. The figure of Margaret, who for a brief moment had been a source of comfort and peace, now begins to fade in his mind, becoming a distant echo, almost unreachable amid the growing distrust that consumes him. He begins to wonder, with growing anguish, Margaret is really the person she appears to be. Could she also have her own hidden interests? Years of negotiations and living surrounded by people who always had ulterior motives made John develop an almost paranoid instinct. Experience taught him that trusting others is a dangerous luxury, and now even Margaret's gentle presence seems suspicious. As John sinks deeper into his suspicions, Margaret, in her modest room in the staff quarters, also finds herself lost in deep reflection. The night is quiet, but her mind is in constant turmoil. She replays John's unusual request, the way he exposed his tortured soul, and the weight of the regrets that crush him. She understands that John's request, although out of the ordinary, was a desperate cry for redemption, for a little peace before the end. The empathy she feels for him is real, but now, recalling what she witnessed that day, Margaret begins to question what her next step should be. She knows that Laura and James have predatory intentions, and the idea of leaving John at their mercy deeply disturbs her. But at the same time, she wonders if she should intervene. She is there as a nurse, not as a judge or savior. And there is a fine line between caring for John's well-being and becoming too involved in his personal affairs. The professional ethics that have always guided her work hold her back, but the human instinct to protect someone in danger urges her to act. The dilemma Margaret faces is not simple. Intervening could compromise her position, but standing by could mean allowing John to suffer at the hands of people who don't care about him. She realizes that, one way or another, she will have to make a choice that could change the course of John's last days. And this weighs heavily on her conscience. As the night progresses, both John and Margaret are trapped in their own emotional labyrinths. John, struggling with his growing distrust, finds himself unable to find a safe harbor amid the storm of his emotion. Margaret, on the other hand, is at the crossroads of her professional duty and her human instinct, aware that the decisions she makes in the coming hours could define not only John's fate, but also her own. The next day, the atmosphere in John Armstrong's mansion becomes even more tense with the arrival of the lawyer. The man, impeccably dressed and with an air of calculated professionalism, carries a leather briefcase containing detailed documents about John's will. He is meticulous, careful with every word he chooses, but there is something in his behavior that arouses John's suspicion, something that the former magnate, even in his frail condition, can still detect. The lawyer, with a soft but firm voice, begins to present his suggestions for adjustments to the will. He argues that certain changes could simplify the succession process, making the transfer of assets to Laura and James easier. The words are carefully chosen, but the subtext does not escape John. He recognizes the maneuver behind the legal language, a subtle attempt to further distance him from control over his own legacy. John, even weakened, is not someone who gives in easily. He feels the weight of each word spoken by the lawyer, each suggestion like an attempt to erase what he has built over his life. His survival instinct, the same one that guided him through complex business deals and helped him amass a fortune, awakens with force. He knows he is in a final battle, not just for his wealth, for control over a destiny he refuses to leave in the hands of others. With a sharp look, John interrupts the lawyer's fluent speech, asking incisive questions. His voice, though trembling, carries the authority of someone who is not willing to be manipulated. Questions the motivations behind the proposed changes, trying to uncover the extent to which the lawyer is involved in Laura's plans. Every evasive answer from the lawyer only fuels John's suspicion. He realizes that the man before him is not just a professional, but perhaps a collaborator in the scheme to strip him of his fortune and dignity. The lawyer in turn becomes visibly unsettled. He hadn't expected that John, so weakened by illness, would still have the energy and discernment to challenge his proposals. The lawyer's composure begins to falter, revealing small signs of nervousness that only confirm John's suspicions. The tension rises, and the meeting that should have been a quiet formality turns into a silent confrontation, where true intentions begin to surface. Meanwhile, Margaret, who had been on the sidelines of the discussion, watching closely, begins to understand the true extent of John's loneliness and despair. She sees in his eyes the internal struggle of a man who, despite everything, is still trying to hold on to some semblance of control over his life. John's vulnerability, combined with his fierce determination, touches Margaret deeply. She realizes that he is fighting an unequal battle, not only against his own physical fragility, but also against those who should be by his side, who now reveal themselves as predators lying in wait. Moved by a mix of empathy and indignation, Margaret decides not to remain passive any longer. She knows that her role as a nurse is limited. But the morality that guides her does not allow her to stand by while John is exploited by those who should love him. Determined to protect what remains of John's dignity and legacy, Margaret begins to take action. With a caution that borders on survival instinct, Margaret starts discreetly investigating, initiating subtle conversations with the mansion's staff. She asks indirect questions, weaving a web of information that slowly begins to reveal the true nature of Laura and James's plans. Clues she gathers, seemingly innocent, begin to paint a dark picture of the conspiracy unfolding under the mansion's roof. Margaret also seeks outside help. She reaches out to old friends, legal experts, people who could provide her with the knowledge needed to understand the intricate details of John's will. She examines every clause, every word, searching for legal loopholes that could be used to protect John. Her nights, once peaceful, are now filled with reading legal documents and formulating plans, all aimed at one goal: ensuring that John is not betrayed in his final moments. As Margaret progresses in her investigation, she begins to uncover more concrete evidence of Laura and James's nefarious intentions. Hidden documents, financial records, confidential emails. Everything starts pointing to a well-orchestrated scheme to strip John of his fortune before he even has a chance to understand what is happening. The magnitude of what she discovers frightens her, but it also strengthens her resolve. Margaret realizes that Laura and James are not just opportunists. They are willing to manipulate and, if necessary, destroy John to achieve their goals. Each new discovery is a knife to Margaret's heart, but also another reason to act. She knows that time is against them. John, in his delicate condition, may not have much time left, and every moment lost is another opportunity for Laura and James to consolidate their power. With this in mind, Margaret prepares for the final battle, a silent and clandestine struggle to ensure that, in the end, John can depart in peace, knowing that, at least in his final days, there was someone who truly cared for him. The next day, as the gray morning begins to illuminate John Armstrong's imposing mansion, Margaret, with a racing heart and a nervousness she hadn't felt in a long time, enters John's room. He is sitting on his bed, his gaze distant, but his mind clearly active, reflecting on his life. She hesitates for a moment, worried about his reaction, but knows the truth must be told. Margaret approaches cautiously and, with a firm yet empathetic voice, begins to reveal what she has discovered. She talks about Laura's manipulations, James's dark intentions, and the possible complicity of the lawyer. John listens in silence, his eyes narrowing as each new piece of information is revealed. As she speaks, John's emotions swing between anger and sadness. Something deeper also emerges, a silent gratitude for Margaret, who, despite everything, has shown herself to be the only person who truly cares about him. When she finishes, Rune falls silent for a moment. Margaret, tense, waits for John's reaction. He takes a deep breath, his eyes still fixed on a distant point, as if weighing every word she said. Then he looks at Margaret, his eyes softening with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "You've risked a lot to bring me this truth, Margaret," John says, his voice weak but full of sincerity. "I didn't expect anyone to still care." Margaret, with a shy smile, responds, "I couldn't just stand by while they tried to take everything from you, Mr. Armstrong. You deserve more than to be a pawn in their game." John feels warmth in his chest, something he hasn't experienced in years. Margaret's presence, her unexpected loyalty, gives him the strength to do what needs to be done. However, he also knows that this revelation brings with it a heavy responsibility. He needs to act quickly and decisively. Time is short. Any mistake could be fatal to his plans. The sharp mind of a man who has spent a lifetime making complex decisions, John begins to devise his final plan. He knows that Laura and James are convinced that he is weakened, that he no longer has the energy to fight them. And that is exactly what he intends to use to his advantage. John decides it's time to play the game more intelligently than ever before. He asks Margaret to arrange a meeting with the lawyer, Laura, and James to discuss the changes to the will. Margaret hesitates for a moment, worried about what he might be planning, but the determination in John's eyes convinces her that he is more lucid than ever. She agrees, and with a heavy heart goes to organize the meeting. Hours later, everyone is gathered in the mansion's grand living room, a room that exuded a silent power, adorned with antique furniture and valuable works of art, a reflection of the wealthy life John had built. The atmosphere is tense, but Laura and James try to mask their anxiety with calculated smiles and expressions of forced concern. The lawyer, seated with his briefcase by his side, awaits instructions, believing the meeting will be a simple formality. John enters the room, supported by a cane, appearing more frail than he truly is. He slowly takes a seat, tending to be weak, and observes the faces around him. "Thank you for coming," he begins, with a voice that, though it sounds tired, carries an underlying authority. "I think it's time to get everything in order." Laura, trying to hide her impatience, steps forward. "Of course, dear. We know how hard this is for you, but we want to make sure everything is done according to your wishes." John almost smiles at the evident hypocrisy in her words, but keeps his expression neutral. He gestures to the lawyer, signaling that he is ready to discuss the proposed changes. The lawyer opens his briefcase and starts explaining the modification, highlighting how everything will be simplified for the benefit of Laura and James. However, instead of simply agreeing, John begins to ask questions, some seemingly innocent, but each more insightful than the last. He probes into specific details, questions legal terms, and makes the lawyer squirm in his chair, struggling to maintain composure in the face of John's unexpected resistance. Each evasive response from the lawyer only deepens John's distrust and gradually reveals the true intentions of everyone in the room. Laura and James, realizing that John is not as submissive as they had expected, start to grow impatient. James, unable to control his temper, lets slip a sarcastic comment, revealing his frustration. John, who had carefully planned every move, recognizes that it is time to deliver the final blow. "I've thought a lot about all this," John says, looking directly at Laura and James, "and I've realized that, despite everything, there are still a few things I need to set right before I go." Pauses, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "So, I've decided that some changes need to be made, but they won't be exactly the changes you're expecting." The lawyer looks at John, surprised and confused, while Laura and James exchange worried glances. John continues, now with a firmer tone. "In fact, I've decided that I'm going to review the entire will, and this time, with the help of someone I truly trust." The room falls silent as everyone tries to process what he has just said. Margaret, who had been watching everything from a distance, feels a mix of relief and admiration for John. He wasn't just resisting. He was taking back control, even in his final moments. Laura, realizing things weren't going as planned, tries to argue, "John, dear, you don't need to do this now. We can." But John interrupts her with a firmness she hadn't seen in years. "I've made my decision, Laura, and this time, no one is going to manipulate me." With that, he rises with Margaret's help and heads towards the door. Before leaving, he turns one last time to the three of them and says, "You all underestimated my will to protect what's mine. And for that, you'll pay a price you can't imagine." As he leaves the room, John feels a renewed energy. He knows that time is against him, but with Margaret by his side, he feels confident that he can ensure his legacy is preserved according to his true wishes, far from the clutches of those only interested in his wealth. Night falls over the Armstrong mansion, and the atmosphere is enveloped in a tense silence. While Laura and James are preoccupied with their own interests, confident that John has been subdued, a clandestine meeting is about to take place. Feeling the urgency of his plans, John asked Margaret to discreetly arrange a meeting with a lawyer he trusts, someone beyond Laura's influence. The lawyer, an experienced middle-aged man with an impeccable reputation, arrives at the mansion without fanfare, escorted by Margaret to John's private study. The study, decorated with heavy mahogany furniture and paintings that display the wealth and power John accumulated over his life, seems the perfect setting for the final move of a magnate who always knew how to turn the game in his favor. When the lawyer enters, he finds John seated in an armchair by the fireplace, the soft flame illuminating his pale but determined face. The lawyer approaches, greets John with respect, and sits across from him, ready to listen to what the old businessman has to say. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," John begins, his voice low but firm. "I need your help to correct a mistake I'm about to make if I don't act quickly." The lawyer, curious and somewhat surprised, leans forward. "I'm here for whatever you need, Mr. Armstrong." John then reveals his intentions. He wants to rewrite his will, ensuring that his fortune is distributed according to his true wishes, not the selfish interests of Laura and James. He wants part of his wealth to go to charitable causes he has always valued, which have been neglected in favor of his family's demands. John speaks with a clarity and determination that impresses the lawyer, especially considering his frail physical condition. Margaret, ever watchful, observes the conversation from a distance, ready to intervene if necessary. She understands the risk they're taking. If Laura or James discovers what's happening, the consequences could be disastrous. However, she remains calm and professional, helping to ensure the meeting proceeds without interruption. After listening carefully, the lawyer agrees to help John. He promises that the changes will be made quickly, and above all, that confidentiality will be maintained. John, relieved but aware that time is not on his side, asks that everything be done before any sign of suspicion arises. "I've always been a man of action," John says, looking the lawyer in the eye. "And even now, I won't let my legacy be distorted by those who only think of themselves. Let's do this the right way." The meeting ends with a firm handshake, a silent pact between two men determined to see justice prevail. Margaret accompanies the lawyer to the exit, discreetly thanking him for his discretion and speed. When she returns to the study, she finds John calmer, but visibly exhausted from the intensity of the meeting. "This needs to be done quickly," Margaret says, his voice now a bit weaker. "We don't know how much time we have." Margaret nods, her expression resolute. "I'll do everything I can to make sure this happens, Mr. Armstrong. We're in this together." As Margaret helps him back to bed, tension in the air is palpable. She knows the final game is in motion, and every move from now on will be crucial. What was at stake was not just John's fortune, but the very legacy he would leave behind, a legacy he was determined to protect at any cost. At that moment, both John and Margaret knew they had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The pieces were in motion, and now it was just a matter of seeing how the game would play out. As the days pass, John's health continues to deteriorate rapidly. Every movement becomes a difficult and painful task, and the weakness in his body increases. However, his mind remains clear and focused, more determined than ever to fulfill his final wishes. He feels the pressure of time running out, and knows he must act quickly to ensure his will is respected. Margaret, attentive to his needs, and with growing admiration for his determination, continues to accompany him. She is deeply involved in the process of ensuring that John's new will is executed. However, the weight of responsibility and the concern over the potential consequences of their actions become increasingly evident to her. The possibility that Laura and James might discover what is happening haunts her, and Margaret feels torn between her duty to care for John and the fear of the repercussion. John's plan is almost uncovered when Laura, noticing her husband's strange and reserved behavior, decides to investigate more deeply. She begins to notice inconsistencies and signs that something is happening behind the scene. Suspicious and irritated, Laura confronts John directly. She accuses him of hiding something and questions his intention, demanding answers about what he is plotting. John, using his usual cunning, denies any involvement in suspicious activities. Skillfully and calmly, he convinces Laura that he's simply trying to cope with his illness the best way he can. Despite her suspicions, Laura accepts John's explanation. Though she remains wary, she decides not to press further, believing that time is still on her side. This confrontation makes John realize just how close he is to being discovered. The tension and urgency push him to intensify his effort. He accelerates the process of altering the will, working with his private lawyer to ensure that all the necessary changes are made quickly. Meanwhile, Margaret works diligently to ensure that every detail is taken care of and that the new will is secured for when John passes. Finally, a new will is completed. In a final act of control over his destiny, John signs the document with a trembling hand, but with a firmness that reflects his resolve to protect his legacy. The lawyer, a trusted man, assures him that the changes will be respected and that John's wishes will be carried out, regardless of Laura and James's plans. John experiences deep relief mixed with overwhelming exhaustion. He feels that, despite all the challenges and physical suffering, he has done everything he could to ensure that his fortune would be used according to his true wishes. Margaret, by his side, also feels relieved, but remains aware that there are still challenges ahead. As the inevitable moment approaches, John reflects on his life. He revisits his choices, his mistakes, and the people he's hurt, with a particular focus on his estranged relationship with his daughter, Emily. These reflections bring a mixture of sadness and acceptance. John realizes that, despite his failures, he has finally done something right by protecting his legacy. Margaret continues to care for John, with a dedication that goes beyond her role as a nurse. He becomes a sincere friend in his final days, listening to his stories and memories with empathy. These conversations offer John a form of reconciliation with his past and help ease his emotional burden. Margaret also faces a deep internal dilemma. She knows she's involved in a plan that could have serious repercussions, especially if Laura and James find out. However, the feeling of doing the right thing strengthens her. She believes that by helping John, she is fulfilling a moral duty despite the personal risks. With each passing day, Margaret becomes more determined to ensure that John's last wish is fulfilled. She continues to protect the will with extreme care and acts cautiously around Laura and James, who remain suspicious but have no concrete proof. An unexpected event occurs when Emily, John's daughter, arrives at the mansion. After years of estrangement, she decides to visit her father before it's too late. Her arrival brings a wave of emotions for John, who is overwhelmed with a mix of joy and regret. He hadn't expected this reconciliation and feels a deep desire to make up for lost time. Emily enters the mansion carrying her own grievances and hesitation. She's unsure how to feel about her father, feels the need to find some closure. In a moment of vulnerability and honesty, John admits his mistakes and asks Emily for forgiveness. He explains the decisions he made and how, even if belatedly, tried to correct his errors and protect what's important to her. Emily listens carefully, struggling to process her conflicting feelings. She sees the pain and regret in her father, and the conversation becomes a space for understanding and forgiveness. With the reconciliation with Emily, John experiences a profound transformation and a sense of peace that had long eluded him. The heartfelt conversation and Emily's forgiveness provide him with a sense of closure and fulfillment he had never known before. The relationship with his daughter, though marked by years of distance, finally finds a place of understanding and connection, brings relief and satisfaction to John. In the last days of his life, John finds himself enveloped in an unexpected serenity. He reflects on the true meaning of life, recognizing that the relentless pursuit of power and wealth that dominated his existence now seems less important than relationships and true love. This new understanding allows John to appreciate the time he spends with Emily, sharing memories and stories and building a deep connection that serves as a balm for his soul. Emily, in turn, begins to see her father from a new perspective. She recognizes John's vulnerability and regret and finds a way to deal with the painful past, allowing both of them to find a sense of peace and closure. The time they spend together becomes a healing space for both, offering mutual comfort that helps soften the pain of years of separation. Margaret, witnessing this transformation, feels a deep sense of accomplishment and gratitude. She realizes that by supporting John and facilitating the reconciliation with Emily, she played a crucial role in resolving issues that had haunted John for so long. Her presence and support helped create the conditions for the meeting with his daughter to be both possible and productive. As she cares for John and sees the peace he has finally found, Margaret begins to reflect on her own life. She understands the importance of being present for others, especially in critical moments, and how this can make a significant difference. Margaret feels strengthened by her experience, seeing human connection and love as central values in her own life. As the end approaches, John, now at peace with himself and his family, faces his final moments with a tranquility he had never experienced before. He dies with the assurance that, despite his mistakes and flaws, he managed to correct a crucial part of his life and leave a legacy that reflects not only his material achievements, but also his love and regret. Laura and James take their seats with ostentatious confidence, as if expecting a reward. Laura tries to maintain her composure, but her gaze betrays a mix of impatience and anticipation. James, more relaxed, seems almost bored, as if the outcome were already certain. Both are convinced that the will confirm their plans to secure John's fortune. Margaret, with a veiled expression of concern, stands next to Emily, who is visibly tense. Margaret knows that the real battle is just beginning, and her mind is constantly reviewing every detail to ensure that what was planned is effectively carried out. Emily, with doubts and conflicting emotions, clutches Margaret's arm, seeking support and strength. The lawyer, with serious and professional demeanor, stands up and begins reading the will. The silence in the room is almost tangible, broken only by the sound of pages turning and the firm voice of the lawyer. The will is read in detail, revealing John's final intentions. Each clause and decision is exposed, and those present watch attentively as the lawyer highlights the major changes. John specifies that a substantial part of his fortune will be allocated to charities and causes he considered important, reflecting his recent decision to change his legacy to something more meaningful than simply accumulating wealth. Emily is included as a beneficiary of a considerable sum, which ensures her financial security and a fresh start. This decision shows John's belated attempt to repair his relationship with his daughter and offer her a chance to restart her life in a more peaceful way. The provisions for Laura and James are reduced from what they had expected. Their inheritance is much smaller than anticipated, with a significant portion of the fortune directed towards other purposes and causes. As the lawyer reads each clause, Laura and James's reactions become evident. Laura tries to hide her frustration, but her face clearly shows signs of irritation. James, in contrast, displays growing anger, unable to contain his reactions of disdain and discontent. Emily, though relieved to receive a part of her father's legacy, remains calm and reserved. She reflects on the meaning of the changes and her father's attempt to correct past wrongs. And although the will cannot erase years of estrangement, it offers her a sense of closure and justice. Margaret, her part, feels profound relief seeing that John's wishes were respected. Her task of protecting the will is now complete, and she watches with a mix of satisfaction and sadness as the reading concludes. She knows her actions were crucial in ensuring that John had the chance to leave a legacy more aligned with his final values. The atmosphere in the mansion's living room becomes electric with Laura's outburst of rage. Her shouts and accusations fill the space as she desperately tries to destabilize the situation. With her face red and her hands shaking, Laura points at the lawyer and Margaret, accusing them of manipulation and taking advantage of John's weakness to divert the legacy she believes is rightfully hers. "You have no idea what you've done," Laura yells. "John wasn't in his right mind when he made these changes. You manipulated him while he was vulnerable. This is injustice, and I'm going to fight it." The lawyer remains calm and firm, facing the storm of accusations with composure. "Ms. Laura, all the changes to the will were made with complete legal compliance. John was fully aware of the decisions he made, and all measures were taken to ensure the validity of the document." Laura, unwilling to accept the explanation, demands a confrontation. "And what do you have to say about this? Prove that he was in full possession of his mental faculties when he made these changes." In response, the lawyer gestures toward a laptop on a nearby table. As an additional precaution and to ensure that his intentions were clearly understood, John made a video explaining his decisions and reasons for the changes in the will. I will play the video now. With a click, the video begins to play. On the screen, John appears in a calm, well-lit setting with a look of determination and serenity on his face. Although his body is frail, his voice is clear and purposeful. "Laura, James," John starts, addressing the two directly. "If you're watching this video, it's because I am no longer here to explain my decisions in person. I made these decisions with full awareness and in full possession of my mental faculty. I know I made many mistakes throughout my life, especially with my daughter Emily. These changes in the will are not just about distributing my fortune, but about doing what I feel is fair and necessary." He pauses for a moment, looking at the camera with an intensity that reveals his deep regret and hope for redemption. "I understand that this may be hard to accept, but I believe this is the right way to correct the mistakes I've made. I want my fortune to be used for causes I consider important and to ensure a better future for my daughter. This is what I feel is right at this moment." The video continues with John explaining how the charities and funds reflect his final values and beliefs. He emphasizes the importance of using the money for something that can benefit society and help those in real need. When the video ends, the room remains silent. Laura and James are visibly shaken, their expressions ranging from disbelief to sadness. The reality of John's words sinks in, and the strength of his message begins to weaken Laura's resistance. Emily, standing beside Margaret, watches the scene with understanding and sadness. She sees the depth of her father's words and feels a mix of emotions. John's decision, though difficult, seems to be a sincere attempt to do good and repair some of the damage done. Margaret, with a look of compassion, observes Laura and James processing what they have just heard. She knows their reaction will be challenging, but also understands that John's video is a powerful testament to his final intentions. Laura, now quieter and more subdued, seems to start accepting the reality. The weight of John's words and the evidence of his clear intent to correct his mistakes begin to make sense, even to her. The tension in the room eases, and the discussion about the next steps becomes inevitable. Emily, as she stands up, says, "Dad, I appreciate your last attempt at making peace. Although the years of distance can't be erased, I acknowledge the effort you made to make things right, and I want you to know that I will do my best to honor your legacy." She then turns to Laura and James, her expression a mix of empathy and determination. "I know this might not fix everything, but I would like to offer you a portion of the inheritance, not as a way to erase the past, but as a way for us to move forward, leave behind the hurts, and find some kind of peace." Laura and James, still processing the impact of the changes to the will and Emily's unexpected offer, find themselves facing a tough choice. Laura, with her anger and shock slowly turning into resignation, realizes that Emily's offer might be the only way to avoid a prolonged conflict that would only bring more pain to everyone. She accepts the offer reluctantly, knowing it is a chance to preserve some kind of relationship, even if fragile. "I accept," Laura says, her voice heavy with restrained emotion. "That's what you want, then I'll accept." James, less emotionally involved in the conflict, thanks Emily sincerely. "Thank you, Emily. I appreciate your generosity. After this exchange, the atmosphere in the mansion begins to shift. Though tension still lingers, there's a sense of resolution in the air. Laura, burdened with the weight of loss and new responsibilities, retreats to a corner of the room. She sits in silence, reflecting on the loss of control and the new reality she will have to face. Let's have some fun with those who only read the comments. They won't understand. Comment Coca-Cola in the comments. Only those who read this far will get it. And now, let's continue with the story. Margaret, witnessing the final transformation of events, feels a deep sense of relief and accomplishment. Her mission with the Armstrong family comes to an end, and she prepares to leave the mansion with a heavy but peaceful heart. Farewell is inevitable, and Margaret knows her role was crucial in ensuring John's last wishes were honored. Before leaving, Margaret has a conversation with Emily. They share a moment of sincerity and emotion, reflecting on the journey that brought them here. Emily, still carrying the responsibility of honoring her father's legacy, thanks Margaret with genuine gratitude. "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you," Emily says, her voice choked with emotion. "You were the only one who truly understood the stakes." Margaret, with a sad smile, responds, "It was an honor to stand by your father and help ensure his wishes were fulfilled. I hope you find peace and happiness and that you use this opportunity to do good in the world." The two embrace, recognizing that, despite the painful circumstances, something positive has emerged from the experience. Margaret leaves the mansion with a sense of duty fulfilled, ready to start a new chapter in her life. She carries with her the certainty that she made a difference, helping John find some degree of peace and reconciliation before his death. Emily, taking on the significant responsibility left to her, begins to transform her life and that of her community. She uses her father's fortune to fund charitable projects and promote social welfare, finding a purpose that helps heal the wounds of the past. Community work and new healthy relationships bring Emily a peace she had never known before, and she learns to cherish her father's memory without regret. The foundation Emily establishes in her father's name becomes a significant force for good, supporting causes John had tried to embrace in his final days. Emily's internal transformation is profound. She feels more connected to her father, understanding that despite his mistakes, John did the best he could in the end. Using the inheritance for the greater good helps her find a sense of purpose and create a positive impact on others' lives. Laura and James, after the impact of John's decisions and Emily's offer, drastically changed their lives. By selling the Armstrong mansion and moving to a modest home, they step away from the pressures of status and power. Laura finds a new sense of peace by cultivating a garden, and James discovers a talent for carpentry. The simple and tranquil life they now lead helps them rediscover the value of simple things and strengthen their bond. Over time, Emily keeps in touch occasionally with Margaret, sharing her experiences and reflection. Margaret settles into a new city and applies the lessons she learned from her time with the Armstrong family in her work at a local clinic. Both feel that, despite the difficulties, they have found new paths and purposes in their lives. John Armstrong's legacy serves as a powerful reminder. True wealth lies not in material possessions, but in human connections and actions, reflect values of love and forgiveness. Although he was a man who made many mistakes, his final days were marked by a sincere quest for redemption and justice. John's legacy is not just about redistributing wealth, but also about how his decisions brought about significant changes in the lives of Emily, Laura, James, and Margaret. His final actions revealed the complexity of his character and his capacity for transformation, leaving an impact that endures long after his death. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more compelling narratives like this one. And share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know what you think. Your participation means a lot to us.